William Shakespeare entered the world in April 1564 in the market town of Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, England. We don't know the exact day he was born because Shakespeare inconveniently did not think to sign his own birth certificate. But we do know he was baptised on April 26, 1564 at Holy Trinity Church, a stone's throw from the River Avon. By tradition, that puts his birth around April 23rd, a date later celebrated as both his birthday and the day he died. So, from the very beginning, he is already doing what he does best, leaving just enough mystery to make everyone argue for 400 years. A dramatic symmetry, very on brand. He grew up on Henley Street, in a home that was comfortable but not aristocratic. This wasn't a castle childhood. This was a working town where people bought wool, traded goods, ate stew, and watched reputations rise and fall over a single unpaid debt. His father was John Shakespeare, a glovemaker and leatherworker. Yes, gloves, as in fashionable hand coverings for people who had the luxury of clean hands. But John wasn't only a craftsman, he also climbed the civic ladder, local offices, town leadership, property owner, and eventually alderman and bailiff, the equivalent of mayor of Stratford. He was a man who knew how to greet the right people and keep his face calm when money was tight. His mother, Mary Arden, came from one of the oldest and wealthiest families in Warwickshire, bringing land, money and social standing into the marriage. If John represented hustle, Mary represented roots, old family, quiet pride, and a certain stubborn resilience. And between them they produced a bustling household. Shakespeare was one of 8 children. 2 older sisters died young. He had siblings who survived, brothers like Gilbert, Richard, Edmund, and sisters, including Anne and Joan. Joan, notably, lived the longest. In other words, William was not born poor, he was born ambitious. Shakespeare grew up in a house where people talked over each other, siblings competed, and attention was a resource you had to earn. Witty barbs were tossed back and forth, and you had to think fast. If you want to know where Shakespeare's razor tongue came from, don't start in London, start at the dinner table in Stratford. In a big family, language becomes sport, defence, and identity. You learn to win with words, fast. Also, death hovered. Childhood mortality was common. Plague waves came and went. People lived with loss the way we live with weather. Unfair, frequent, and never fully predictable. That early awareness of life's fragility and society's cruelty shows up later in everything he wrote. Young William almost certainly attended the King's New School in Stratford, a free grammar school just a short walk from his home on Henley Street. There, he would have studied Latin grammar, rhetoric, classical history, and Roman playwrights like Plautus, Terence, and Seneca. No university followed, and this fact would haunt him forever. That missing university credential may have lit a quiet fire in him. When you don't have the approved stamp, you either shrink or you overperform so hard the stamp becomes irrelevant. Shakespeare did the second thing, and if you've ever met someone who was underestimated early in life, you'll recognise the pattern, the edge, the humour that cuts, the need to dominate the room through brilliance. Not arrogance exactly, something sharper, a survival instinct dressed as wit. Also, and this is wild speculation, perhaps he didn't attend university because of his early marriage to Anne Hathaway. Could there have been some resentment there? Perhaps his marriage to her was out of obligation rather than love. This is also a theme that shows up throughout his work. But here's the twist. Despite becoming the greatest writer in English history, Shakespeare's spelling was atrocious. His surviving signatures, 6 of them, show wildly inconsistent spellings of his own name. Punctuation, optional, spelling rules, suggestions at best. He didn't write neatly, he wrote brilliantly. At 18 years old, William married Anne Hathaway of Shottery, a nearby village. We don't know for certain how they met, but we can guess reasonably. Parish life, village gatherings, family connections, Stratford and Shottery were close enough that people's lives overlapped constantly. She was 26, 8 years his elder, and here's the snag, she was also pregnant. Historians call it a hasty marriage. The rest of us call it a shotgun wedding in Elizabethan clothing. Their first child, Susanna, was baptised in May 1583, only 6 months after the wedding. 2 years later came twins, Hamnet and Judith. This was no scandalous elopement. It was a hurried, lawful marriage, granted a special licence by the church. Shakespeare did the honourable thing. That sense of honour, mixed with discomfort, mixed with consequences, may be part of why Shakespeare writes women with such complexity. Some are noble, some are cunning, some are trapped. He also knew well what a town could do to the reputation of a tarnished woman. Life at home must have been hectic for Shakespeare, trying to write in a house with 3 noisy children and possibly a less than sympathetic wife. There is no empirical data that states or even implies that Shakespeare was unhappy with family life, but his actions speak volumes. In 1585, he simply vanishes. From roughly 1585 to 1592, there is no clear record of where he was or what he was doing. Historians call this period the lost years. When he reappears, however, he is in London, writing plays that cause established writers to panic. Anne and the children remain in Stratford. In 1592, playwright Robert Greene publicly sneered at Shakespeare as an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers. Translation: who let this grammar school kid into our profession? London in the 1590s was loud, brutal, thrilling, and dangerous. Imagine it as a mix of Broadway, a street market, a political rumour mill, and a public health hazard. Shakespeare enters the theatre world and begins writing for a company that would become one of the biggest names in English performance. Shakespeare was not just a poet. He was a professional, a working writer writing on deadlines, for actors, for ticket sales, for applause, for survival. And he became a shareholder in theatre enterprises. This is the part people forget. He wasn't starving in an attic scribbling sonnets with candle wax tears. He was not a pauper. He was building wealth. Remember, he grew up watching his father's tenacity and his mother's sense of strong will and self-confidence. He wrote plays that pulled crowds. He adapted stories. He remixed old plots like a DJ, except with daggers and verse. He was becoming his own masterpiece. He borrowed plots shamelessly. He invented over 1,700 new words, many of which we still use today unknowingly. He wrote insults so savage, we're still afraid to repeat them. He invented words. He invented phrases. He invented a style that could sound like a king and a drunk in the same scene. And his insults, his verbal jousting, was the talk of the time. They are the original reed. Shakespeare didn't just write drama. He wrote dialogue that could win a verbal fight instantly. Shakespeare joined the Lord Chamberlain's Men, an acting company under noble patronage. He was not just a writer, he was an actor, shareholder, and company man. When theatres closed due to plague, he wrote narrative poems like Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. When theatres reopened, he flooded the city with plays. By 1599, the company built the Globe Theatre on the south bank of the Thames, and Shakespeare owned a share. This is crucial. Shakespeare did not just write art, he built infrastructure. By 1597, Shakespeare was wealthy enough to buy New Place, the second largest house in Stratford. He later purchased land, tithes, and investments. He sued people who owed him money. He loaned grain during shortages. He managed risk. The image of Shakespeare as a starving poet. Utter nonsense. He was a businessman who wrote plays, not the other way around. In August 1596, Shakespeare's only son, Hamnet, died at age 11. The cause is unknown. After this loss, Shakespeare's writing darkens. Not immediately, but profoundly. Themes of grief, fathers and sons, mortality and remembrance rise to the surface. A few years later, a grieving father would ask, to be or not to be? It is impossible to read Hamlet without hearing echoes of his son Hamnet. Shakespeare wrote for Queen Elizabeth I and later King James I, who became patron of the renamed King's Men in 1603. This was not a minor honour. It meant protection, prestige, and proximity to power. Shakespeare's plays were performed at court, celebrated in print, and quoted everywhere, taverns, streets, and royal halls alike. He was famous in his lifetime. That is rare. Despite his London success, Shakespeare remained legally tied to Stratford. Anne and the children stayed there, managing the household. By 1613, Shakespeare retired from London and returned to Stratford for good. He was not disgraced, he was done. Shakespeare stops writing regularly and returns to Stratford. No dramatic announcement, no curtain call, he simply stops. Maybe he was tired, maybe ill, maybe financially secure enough to step away. Maybe the London grind lost its magic. Or maybe he knew when to leave the party before people stopped listening. That's the irony. The man who wrote the greatest exits chose a quiet one for himself. He had written nearly 40 plays, 154 sonnets, and reshaped the English language. Shakespeare revised his will shortly before his death. It is meticulous, detailed, legal. He left money and property to his daughters Susanna and Judith. To Anne, he famously left "my second best bed." To modern ears, it sounds like a slap. But, historically, the best bed could be reserved for guests. The marital bed, the bed of private life, could be the second best. It may have been a private tenderness, or it may have been a complicated gesture from a complicated man. A marriage that survived, but perhaps not romantically, and a final line that keeps everyone guessing, which is frankly very Shakespeare. One sentence, endless interpretation. One wonders what Anne thought of this. Alas, we will never know. According to English law, as his wife, she was automatically entitled to 1/3 of his estate. Perhaps this was not an insult. The best bed was reserved for guests. The second best was the marital bed, private, intimate, shared. He also left instructions for generous sums to his friends and business partners, his sister and her children, and instructions for his own funeral arrangements. William Shakespeare died on April 23rd, 1616, and was buried at Holy Trinity Church, where he had been baptized 52 years earlier. His gravestone bears a warning, likely written by himself, begging future generations not to move his bones. He never went to university, he spelled poorly, he borrowed plots shamelessly, and yet he gave us love, jealousy, ambition, madness, humour, grief, and over 1,700 words still used today. He did not just write about humanity, he defined it. And that is William Shakespeare. He wrote people the way they are, noble and petty, loving and cruel, ridiculous and profound. And he wrote with a confidence that feels like ownership, because in his world language was power, and he had more of it than anyone else. So yes, the man, the myth, the legend, a playwright who was also a businessman, a family man who lived apart, a genius who may have had insecurities sharp enough to cut steel, a wordsmith whose insults still draw blood, a writer whose work outlived empires. And if he could see the modern world, movies, rap lyrics, dating apps, he'd probably be horrified, then secretly thrilled, then horrified again. And finally, he'd turn to the audience, smirk, and say, "Still quoting me, are you? Of course you are." I hope you enjoyed this special presentation. If so, please subscribe to this channel for more of the same. Quiz King Entertainment also has a host of great quizzes and educational games to suit every taste. Check it out. Thank you for watching.